Welcome to the Clubhouse. Today's guest is Guy Snodgrass. He's a Top Gun instructor and a U.S. Navy and Marine Corps expert in air-to-air combat and tactical development. We'll be discussing what it takes to be a Top Gun pilot, our current situation in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and his thoughts on the 1986 movie with Tom Cruise. Can you kind of tell us how realistic you think the first film was in terms of the aerial maneuvers, the training exercises that were portrayed?
So the original film, 1986 is when it came out, and you realize that, Hollywood's going to take a little bit of liberty to spice things up, but by and large, the U.S. Navy worked in collaboration with Paramount Pictures. They put cameras on the actual aircraft. They flew these real dynamic maneuvers. The flying scenes were incredibly authentic. The dogfighting, the taking off and landing from an aircraft carrier. And that's one of the things that even to this day, and I admit I'm guilty of watching the movies at least maybe a couple dozen times at this point in my life. And I still love them. I still think that the flying scenes are some of my favorite parts.
I heard a rumor that among real fighter pilots, if you quote from the movie Top Gun, you'll get fined $5. Is that true?
Yeah, so there's an element of truth to that. It's not amongst all fighter pilots. It's only amongst former or current Top Gun instructors. There's a fine system to help with the professionalism of the staff. And so if you quote from a certain movie from 1986,
I feel the need for speed.
on the spot, you owe $5. And I've seen it happen on several occasions where someone accidentally, the quote pops out of their mouth and another instructor will turn around and be like, you're paying the fine right now. And they have to break open their wallet and hand over $5. When you think about professionalism, there's a $1 fine for every minute you're late to a meeting or to a flight briefing. So there's all these different fines that we will employ. A lot of it's in good fun, but at the same time, it reinforces that professionalism. And then of course, we collect all that money and use it to do cookouts for the students or other fun things like that.
So I see you have a fighter jet model on your bookshelf back there behind you.
Plane you can see over my shoulder is called the FA-18E. It's a Super Hornet is how we refer to it. And that's how I got started. So in the original Top Gun movie, you had the F-14 Tomcat, you had the A-4 Skyhawk and some other airplanes that were demonstrated.
Watch the birdie.
They had taken that original design and they made a lot of upgrades. They put brand new engines into it. They increased the ability to carry more fuel and more weapons. And so that's what became known as the Super Hornet. I had a chance both as a Top Gun instructor and then later on as a commanding officer of my own fighter squadron to fly every variant from A through F, and then also another plane called the EA-18G Growler.
So what is it like to really be an elite Top Gun fighter pilot?
Right, that's where the Hollywood depiction of Top Gun and then the reality starts to diverge somewhat. There's going to be plenty of scenes where you're all singing in a bar. You're playing beach volleyball. It looks like just a complete party day in and day out. The reality behind Top Gun is it's an incredibly professional organization. There's a relatively small number of men and women who serve as Top Gun instructors, somewhere on the order of maybe 25, 26 at any given point in time. And so when you compare those numbers against the entirety of the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps, who they represent as subject matter experts, there's a lot riding on their shoulders.
How do the students change from their first day of training to when they graduate?
Students are drawn from across the entirety of the Navy and Marine Corps. And then the Top Gun staff, of course, is looking for three major things. We're looking for an individual's talent. Obviously you'd like to see someone who's at least average, if not above average, in their capability as a fighter pilot. You're looking for their passion because you want to know that they're willing to put in the long hours, they're willing to do what it takes to succeed. And then the last one, which I think surprises people, is that we're looking for personality. A Top Gun instructor at the end of the day is not only a leader, but they're also a teacher. Day one, when they walk in, they're really eager, they're fresh, they've just come out of their first tour of duty as a fighter pilot. And now you're really immersing them, expanding their knowledge base, really working with them to become the very best and the finest fighter pilot they can be. So what you see walking out on graduation is definitely different than what you saw walking in on day one.
When you went into the school initially, how long ago was that, and how has the student makeup kind of changed since then?
I had come out of Operation Iraqi Freedom back in 2005. And that was when I applied to be a Top Gun instructor. I was selected. I wound up graduating as a student, became an instructor in the fall of 2005 and the beginning of 2006. And then I was there to the midpoint of 2008. So about 2.5 years. And so the overall composition of the team has remained the same. The overall division of labor has remained the same, but the things have changed. Of course, technology continues to accelerate forward. And so there's a lot of new capabilities. Throughout the history of the program, it's always been taking a very clear-eyed look at the environment around you. When you think about the United States military, it's representative from the citizens in which it serves, right? So you draw men and women from all around the country, and in some cases the world, as we work with allies and partners, and they'll send individuals into our military to work with us. And you've seen a pretty significant shift over the last decade or two as the military has prioritized diversity, not just in race, gender, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, but also background and experience and ideas. So the more diverse your workforce is, typically the more capable you are of addressing significant challenges faced today. So you've seen that over the course of time. When I first started out as a fighter pilot back in 2001, 2002, it was very normal to see a fighter squadron that was just all almost similar looking, white male. And then now you see a lot more diversity with men and women, individuals of color, et cetera, in a fighter squadron. And I certainly would say that we're better off for it.
So one thing also that people find interesting from the films is that everybody seems to have a call sign.
Rooster, watch your back, Phoenix.
We gotta move, Coyote.
Who are your friends? Payback, fanboy.
Did you guys all have call signs?
Yeah, we certainly do. In fact, it was really neat at Top Gun. One of the cool things about being an instructor there is not only did you already walk in the door with a call sign, but they also had a sketch artist. Like in my case, my call sign was bus. So they would draw essentially what you would use as a slide in your presentation. When you introduce yourself, I'd say, hey, my name is Lieutenant Guy Snodgrass, call sign bus. And behind me, there would be this artist's rendition of my call sign. So in this case, it was an F-18 fighter plane painted all yellow like a school bus with some school bus stripes on the side. He's holding a piece of chalk. Every slide was a play on their call sign.
How do people get their call signs?
So a little context, usually call signs, and I'm happy to say this, right? So in the movie, you've got Maverick, you've got Goose, Iceman, that kind of stuff. So it's like these really kind of cool call signs. That's not the case usually in the real Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, et cetera. Usually, I think in a very positive sense, they kind of keep your ego in check. It could be anything. It could be your last name. Like one guy in my squadron whose call sign was Cuss, because he was on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. He had no idea that his radio was basically jammed on. And so he was transmitting constantly, and when you transmit, you can't hear. And so he's so angry, he's yelling at people, and normally no one would hear him, but of course now he's transmitting out to everybody. So they named him Cuss for that. And then in my case, my call sign's Bus. I got that because it was one of those kind of opposites call signs. So when I showed up in my fighter squadron, I'm about 145 pounds soaking wet. I'm a rail thin kid. And at that same point in time in the NFL, you had the Pittsburgh Steelers and their running back, who's just a giant beast of a human being named Jerome Bettis. I like to tell people I was named the Bus because if you want to succeed, hey, hand me the football, I'll help you get it into the end zone. That's not the reality. The reality is like, hey, that guy was a tremendous athlete. So if you want to see the opposite of what a tremendous athlete looks like, check out Guy.
In light of the current conflict with Russia invading Ukraine, from your point of view, what do you think of the Ukrainian and Russian Air Force performance? And in particular, how would you feel also flying over such a complex aerial battlefield?
If you think about the conflict itself between Russia and Ukraine, it has not gone the way that many military pundits and national security specialists thought it would. The prevailing opinion when Russia first invaded Ukraine was that they would make very quick work of the Ukrainian armed forces. They would roll all the way to Kyiv and foster or foment a regime change pretty quickly. And that's not the case. What we've seen is this stalemate that's occurred. And a lot of that's because of the inability for Russia to assert air dominance over the country of Ukraine. You do see a fair number of helicopters trying to work within the country, but as you mentioned, when you talk about Stinger missiles and other surface-to-air batteries, there's been quite a few videos out there where they're being shot down as well. There was this long-standing belief that a stronger adversary could come in, they could establish their air zone of control, their ground forces could operate with impunity. So it's one of those things where whether it's the surface-to-air batteries or Russia's inability to actually get the planes into Ukraine, it's unfortunately hasn't progressed the way they want. And I think it's the same for Ukraine. Russian forces have quite a bit of anti-air capabilities themselves. So that kind of stretches into how we've seen things adapt. As you mentioned, if you are a fighter plane or a fighter pilot operating over the skies of Ukraine, you're probably a little nervous because of the sheer amount of surface-to-air missiles that are in the country. So you've seen Ukraine turn turn to the use of drones, and they've done so quite successfully. There's a drone that comes from the country of Turkey that they've used quite successfully to conduct attacks on a surface ship out at sea. They've blown up a lot of tanks and armored vehicles that way.
Do you think the U.S. Navy trains pilots well enough to survive in a situation like what's going on right now?
When it comes to the United States Navy and the Marine Corps and all U.S. forces, your question is, are they trained for it, and would they be well equipped? And I think the short answer is yes. We do train very significantly to a surface-to-air threat, and we train very heavily to defend against missiles or even ground fire. But at the same time, asymmetric warfare is becoming more of a standard, where countries around the world are investing in new technologies. As that technology continues to improve, you're going to see more and more contested regions pop up where it's going to be difficult to assert air dominance over a battle space.
Do you think that air forces around the world are kind of trying to get some lessons from that?
Militaries of the world are students of history. When I went to the U.S. Naval War College up in Newport, Rhode Island, we were studying everything back to the ancient Greeks. And so you're always a student of history and what worked, what didn't work. And then, of course, as you get into more of the modern history in the time period we're in now, you better believe every nation and every nation's military is watching the battle in Ukraine to determine, well, what are the things that continue to work like they have traditionally? The inability to create that air superiority, well, that's changed as part of the calculus. And I think the one country that's probably watching this with a lot of attention is China. There's been no mystery about the fact that they want to reclaim their wayward province, as they see it, of Taiwan. And so now you're watching Russia conduct a similar type of operation where Russia feels that Ukraine is more of a wayward province. It's still originally part of Russia's historical territory, so they want to claim that back. So I think that not only the military outcomes, but also the political outcomes. Many of the nations around the world have banded together, especially the democratic-leaning ones, to repudiate Russia, to push back, to support Ukraine, should be giving members of the Chinese military and their political leadership pause as they think about how they want to approach Taiwan.
How long do you think it'll take for this conflict to draw to a close?
I think you're going to see a little bit of this tit for tat over the course of the coming weeks and possibly even months. Certainly, the Ukrainians would love to see a situation where Russian forces pull out of the country, and then potentially they even gain the provinces back that Russia had annexed, like the Crimea. When you think about war, you think about the military aspects, but war is just a continuation of politics by other means. It's really going to be a political solution that brings the war to a close.
Can you tell us about your time as a commander of Strike Fighter Squadron 195 in Japan? From your point of view, what are our allied air forces like, particularly in Japan?
We've talked across a couple different questions about, what it was like being a Top Gun instructor and a little bit about the progression of the career. But usually, when you start off as a junior officer, you're a very junior pilot, you're tactically proficient. And then over the course of a 15 or 16 year career as a pilot, you're given the opportunity for greater responsibility. And so for me, a lot of that culminated, as you mentioned, as the commanding officer for a strike fighter squadron, the Dam Busters, that were home ported in Japan. So in our case, we were home ported in the outskirts of Tokyo, about 40 kilometers to the southwest. There was a base called Atsugi Naval Air Station. Amazing opportunity. All the skill sets that I'd learned as a Top Gun instructor went into play, not only to be proficient as the lead or the most senior fighter pilot in a squadron, but then also the leadership aspects and the leadership attributes. I had 2 tours of duty there. My first one was shortly after I'd been at Top Gun as an instructor. I was stationed in Japan for 3.5 years, learned a lot, and I saw a lot of things that I wanted to change. And so this gets to the second part of your question. What was it like working with partner air forces, specifically Japan's? For example, at Atsugi Air Base, you had a single runway running down the middle of the base. On one side, you had all the Japanese forces and airplanes. On the other side, you had all the American forces and our airplanes, but never the two should meet. So we didn't operate with them on a daily basis. We didn't do a lot of exchange programs or talk to them. So that was something when I came back out as a commanding officer that I sought out to change. And we created a program. It was called Benkyokai, which is a Japanese word for collaborative partnership. It's how you exchange information. And so we worked with some of the Japanese maritime air self-defense forces. They're flying, in this case, some older American equipment called the F-4 Phantom fighter plane. And so we found kind of a sister squadron and we befriended them. We would do collaborations where we would travel to Hayakuri, which is an air base in the region of Japan. and we would learn. We would walk around their flight line. We would learn about their airplanes and how they conduct operations. And then maybe a month later, we would reverse that and we'd bring them to Atsugi so they could learn from us and see our airplanes. So we started off very basic, and then we started also conducting flights together, and we grew this over time to something fairly substantial that continues to today. And that gets you really to the fundamental part of your question. They're flying the F-35 Lightning II now, so they have a very advanced aircraft, and they're really professional and they're really dedicated to try and be the best they can be. Heaven forbid there's a conflict where we have to work together in the Indo-Pacific, then you know that we're going to be coming at that problem from a very similar viewpoint, and we'll be able to work and interoperate together really well.
Can you give me some examples of a few things that your squadron might have learned from theirs?
A lot of it is, Japan occupies a very interesting geopolitical situation. So one is geography. It's an island nation, or a series of islands as part of their nation that is in the Pacific Ocean. It's in close proximity to Russia, close proximity to China, close proximity to North Korea, which are three nations that are seen as traditionally hostile to Japan and to American interests. And so on the one hand, it's a little bit like the situation in the Middle East with Israel. You have a lot of threat nations around you, or nations that could cause you harm. And so they're incredibly vigilant. They're very laser focused on their performance and making sure that they're ready to go at a moment's notice. And I think that sometimes it's easy for Americans to lose sight of the fact that there are those traditional concerns around the world, because we're blessed with our geography. We have the Pacific Ocean on one side, the Atlantic Ocean on the other, Canada to the north, Mexico to the south. So we're relatively kind of ensconced in this bubble of safety, and we don't have to worry too much about having an adversary on our doorstep. Well, that's not the case for Japan. So I love their diligence. I think we learned a lot from seeing how they tackle problems. And of course, culturally, the Japanese view of the world is very different in some respects than the American view of the world. And so anytime you can take different cultures, if you think about diversity, anytime you can bring a lot of diverse groups together and you can kind of weigh and measure each group's perspectives, you'll learn something new every single time.
Are there any interesting anecdotes you could share from your time in Japan? Did you have some fun there?
It was an absolute blast. I'm married, I have 3 young children, and so we had a chance to travel the country, use the high-speed bullet trains. I mean, there's just a lot of really neat things to see in Japan, not only from the ground, but from the sky as well. One of the things that we love to do, if there was a little bit of extra gas in your fuel tank at the end of a mission, was to talk to the Japanese controllers and request it wasn't really a flyby per se, but it was kind of like taking a mini tour. So to the west of Atsugi Air Base was Fujisan, which is Mount Fuji, the tallest mountain in Japan. And so you could ask them to transition from what we call instrument flight rules to a different style, which is visual flight rules. Basically, it just means that it's your responsibility to see and avoid other aircraft, but now you have the flexibility to fly around relatively unfettered. And it's actually pretty funny. There's some lore with pilots and military forces that are stationed in Japan. And the saying always went that if you didn't climb Mount Fuji while you were stationed there, you were destined to come back. And so it's kind of funny, because my first tour of duty, I didn't climb Mount Fuji, and then come to find out I came back.
If you want to read more stories with military content, go to Popular Mechanics online.